The rules changed the moment the mirror stopped showing who everyone expected me to be. It happened on an ordinary evening that was supposed to be forgotten by morning. Instead, it became the dividing line between my old life and everything that followed. For years, I believed beauty was something other people decided for you. It was a checklist built from opinions, expectations, and comparisons. Every magazine, every advertisement, every stranger seemed to have another rule about how a person should look, behave, or present themselves. I spent years trying to follow those invisible rules. The strange part was that no matter how closely I followed them, they never made me happier. They only made me quieter. One rainy evening, while cleaning the attic of my grandmother's old house, I found a dusty wooden vanity covered by a white sheet. The mirror had tiny cracks around the edges, but the reflection was perfectly clear. Taped to one corner was a handwritten note: "Beauty begins where fear ends." I smiled at the sentence. At first, it sounded like another inspirational quote, but something about it stayed with me. I carried the vanity into a spare room and spent hours restoring it. As I polished the wood and cleaned the glass, I realized I was doing the same thing to myself. Removing years of dust. Years of self-doubt. Years of believing I needed someone else's approval before I could appreciate who I was. That night I stood in front of the restored mirror for a long time. For the first time in years, I wasn't searching for flaws. I wasn't comparing myself to anyone. I simply looked. And I noticed something unexpected. The person in the reflection looked tired from pretending. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Tired of chasing impossible standards. Tired of trying to fit into expectations that never truly belonged to me. The next morning, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. If beauty is rules, maybe it's time to write my own. That single sentence became the beginning of a completely different life. I stopped asking what looked impressive. I started asking what felt authentic. I stopped making choices because they were popular. I started making choices because they reflected my values. At first, the changes were almost invisible. I smiled more often. I worried less about small imperfections. I spent more time creating than comparing. People around me noticed something different. "You seem happier," one friend said. "You look more confident," another added. The funny thing was that nothing dramatic had happened overnight. The biggest transformation wasn't visible in the mirror. It happened in the way I thought about myself. That was the first rule I rewrote. Beauty is not a competition. It is a relationship with yourself. And once I understood that, every other rule began to change. The first rule changed the way I looked at myself. The second rule changed the way I looked at everyone else. For years, I had believed confidence belonged to people who never doubted themselves. I assumed they woke up every morning certain of who they were and never questioned their choices. Then I started paying attention. The people I admired, most still had fears. They still made mistakes. They still had days when nothing went according to plan. The difference was simple. They didn't allow those moments to define them. That realization completely changed my perspective. Instead of trying to become fearless, I started becoming resilient. Whenever something didn't go as planned, I asked one question: what can this teach me? The answer was always worth more than the disappointment. One afternoon, I visited a small bookstore hidden between two old buildings downtown. The owner was an elderly woman who seemed to know every book on every shelf. As I looked around, she handed me a worn notebook. "This belonged to someone who visited here for years," she said. "They asked me to give it to the right person someday." I laughed. "How do you know I'm the right person?" She smiled. "Because you stopped looking at the cover of books and started reading what's inside." That answer stayed with me. The notebook wasn't filled with famous quotes or life-changing secrets. It contained ordinary observations, small lessons, simple reminders. One page read, "The world changes when your questions change." Another said, "Stop asking if you're enough. Start asking what you can become." Those words followed me home. That evening I added another rule to my notebook. Growth begins where comparison ends. From that day forward, I spent less time measuring my progress against other people. Instead, I compared today's version of myself with yesterday's. Some days the improvement was obvious. Some days it was almost impossible to notice. but every small step mattered. Weeks later, I accepted an invitation to join a community project restoring abandoned public spaces. I had never participated in anything like it before. The work was difficult. Long hours. Unexpected problems. Different personalities. But there was something beautiful about watching neglected places slowly come back to life. One afternoon, while repainting an old community center, I realized something. People weren't only rebuilding the building. They were rebuilding their confidence. Everyone brought different skills. Some painted. Some repaired furniture. Some organized supplies. Nobody tried to be everything. Everyone contributed something. That lesson stayed with me. Real confidence isn't proving you can do everything alone. It's knowing your strengths while respecting the strengths of others. Months later, the project was finished. Families filled the building again. Children laughed in rooms that had been empty for years. The place felt alive. Standing there, I understood another rule. Beauty is not created by perfection. Beauty grows through care, patience, and purpose. Looking back, I realized my journey had never really been about changing my appearance. It was about changing the story I kept telling myself. The old story said I had to earn confidence. The new story said confidence grows every time you choose honesty over fear. And once that story changed, everything else slowly changed with it. A year after I wrote my first rule, I stopped counting how many things had changed. Instead, I started noticing how naturally those changes had become part of my life. The notebook that once held uncertain thoughts was now filled with ideas, goals, and reflections. Every page reminded me that personal growth is never one dramatic leap. It is built through hundreds of ordinary moments that most people never notice. One Saturday morning, I decided to take a train to a small coastal town I had never visited before. There was no special reason. I simply wanted to experience somewhere unfamiliar. Walking through the quiet streets, I found a tiny art gallery inside a renovated lighthouse. The paintings were created by local artists, and each one told a different story about change, hope, and resilience. One painting caught my attention immediately. It showed a butterfly sitting beside its empty cocoon instead of flying away. A small card underneath read, "Transformation doesn't erase where you came from. It reminds you how far you've traveled." I stood there for several minutes. Most stories celebrate the finish line. Very few celebrate the journey that made the finish possible. That afternoon, I met the artist, an older man quietly arranging new canvases. I asked why he painted the butterfly beside the cocoon instead of in the sky. He smiled. Because people admire success. He paused. But they rarely appreciate the process that creates it. That conversation stayed with me long after I left the gallery. On the train ride home, I looked through my notebook again. This time, I wasn't searching for answers. I was searching for patterns. Every breakthrough in my life had started with curiosity. Every meaningful friendship had begun with one conversation. Every achievement had started before I believed I was ready. None of those moments felt extraordinary while they were happening. Only later did I realize they were turning points. The next week, I started a personal challenge. Every evening before going to sleep, I wrote down one thing I had learned that day. Some lessons were simple. Patience creates better results than rushing. Listening carefully often teaches more than speaking. Small improvements become remarkable when repeated consistently. Other lessons came from unexpected experiences. Missing a train introduced me to someone with an incredible life story. Taking a different route home led me to discover a peaceful park I had never noticed. A failed project forced me to develop a better idea. Slowly, I realized that life was full of opportunities disguised as inconveniences. The biggest difference between my old mindset and my new one wasn't confidence. It was perspective. Years ago, I saw obstacles as signs to stop. Now I saw them as invitations to adapt. That single change influenced every decision I made. One evening, while reading through the first pages of my notebook, I found the sentence that had started everything. If beauty is rules, maybe it's time to write my own. I smiled. Not because I had finished writing them, because I finally understood there would never be a final list. Life keeps changing. People keep growing. New experiences create new lessons. The rules that truly matter are not the ones handed to us by the world. They are the values we choose to live by every single day. And perhaps that was the most beautiful discovery of all. Real transformation is never about becoming someone perfect. It is about becoming someone who is always willing to keep learning. Time has a quiet way of testing every lesson we believe we have learned. Nearly 3 years had passed since I wrote the first page in that notebook, and life was no longer filled with exciting firsts. Instead, it was filled with ordinary routines, unexpected setbacks, and moments that asked a much harder question. Would I still live by the values I had chosen when nobody was watching? That question mattered more than any mirror ever could. One autumn morning, I was invited to mentor a group of young designers who were preparing for their first public exhibition. They were talented, but most of them shared the same problem. They were afraid to show their work. Not because it wasn't good, because they feared it wasn't perfect. As I listened to them, I heard my younger self in every sentence. What if people don't like it? What if someone does it better? What if I fail? I smiled because I had asked those exact questions years before. Instead of giving a long speech, I placed 2 blank sheets of paper on the table. On one page I wrote, "Perfect." On the other I wrote, "Progress." Then I asked everyone a simple question. Which page has the power to change your future? Most of them pointed toward the page labeled "Perfect." I shook my head. That page will stay empty forever. Then I held up the second page. This one becomes valuable the moment you make your first mark. The room became silent. One by one, everyone picked up a pencil and began sketching. Some drawings were rough. Some ideas didn't work. Some people erased more lines than they kept. But by the end of the afternoon, every blank page had become something unique. No masterpiece had been created that day. Something much more important had happened. Everyone had stopped waiting for perfection. Walking home that evening, I realized the lesson applied to far more than art. Relationships improve through honest conversations. Dreams become reality through consistent effort. Confidence grows through repeated action. Nothing meaningful begins fully finished. A few weeks later, the exhibition opened to the public. Visitors admired the creativity on display, but what impressed me most wasn't the artwork. It was the confidence on the faces of the people standing beside it. They were no longer hiding behind doubt. They were proudly sharing something they had created. At that moment, another rule found its place in my notebook. Perfection is a destination that keeps moving. Progress is a path you can walk today. Years earlier, I believed beauty depended on flawless results. Now I understood that beauty often lives inside effort, persistence, and the courage to begin again after disappointment. Looking back, I realized none of the most meaningful chapters of my life had started with certainty. They all started with one small decision.
To try.
To learn.
To keep moving.
And perhaps those were the only rules that had ever truly mattered. The rest were simply opinions waiting to be forgotten. The years that followed taught me something I never expected. Growth does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, hidden inside everyday choices that seem too ordinary to matter. One winter evening, I found myself walking through the neighborhood where I had spent most of my childhood. The streets looked smaller. The buildings looked older. Even the park where I once played seemed different. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. I stopped outside the community library, a place I hadn't entered in years. Inside, almost everything was familiar. The shelves, the reading tables, the quiet atmosphere. As I wandered through the aisles, I noticed a young student sitting alone, surrounded by books and crumpled pages. They looked frustrated. Every few minutes they would write something, stop, tear the page away, and begin again. Finally, I walked over and asked gently, "How many pages have you thrown away today?" The student looked embarrassed. I wanted to be perfect. I smiled because I recognized that feeling immediately. Without saying anything else, I picked up one of the blank sheets from the table and folded it into a simple paper airplane. I tossed it gently across the room. The student laughed. "What was that for?" I smiled. That piece of paper finally had a purpose the moment I stopped worrying about making it perfect. For a second, they simply stared at the airplane. Then they laughed again. The tension disappeared. They picked up a fresh page and started writing without stopping every few seconds. Sometimes people don't need complicated advice. Sometimes they just need permission to continue. Walking home later that evening, I realized how much my own definition of success had changed. Years ago, success meant reaching a destination. Now it meant becoming someone who never stopped learning. There would always be another goal, another challenge, another opportunity to improve. That wasn't exhausting anymore. It was exciting, because every new experience meant another chance to grow. When I returned home, I opened the notebook that had traveled with me through every stage of my journey. Most of the pages were full now. Not with perfect handwriting, not with flawless ideas, but with honest thoughts collected over many years. Near the final pages, I wrote another simple rule. Your future is built by the habits nobody applauds. I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf. It no longer represented unfinished questions. It represented a life spent choosing progress instead of fear. As I turned off the lights, I looked toward the mirror one last time. For the first time, I wasn't looking for proof that I had changed. I already knew I had. Not because the reflection was different, because the person standing behind it had finally learned that confidence isn't something you discover once. It's something you quietly rebuild every single day. And that daily decision, repeated over time, becomes the most beautiful transformation of all. Several months later, I opened the notebook one final time. The pages had become worn from being read so often. The first entries were filled with uncertainty, questions, and hopes that seemed impossible at the time. The final pages were different. They weren't filled with perfect answers. They were filled with experience. I slowly turned back to the very first sentence I had written. If beauty is rules, maybe it's time to write my own. For a long moment, I simply smiled. I remembered the person who had written those words. Someone searching for approval. Someone afraid of making mistakes. Someone who believed confidence was something other people were born with. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I wouldn't give complicated advice. I would simply say, keep going. Because almost everything I once worried about eventually disappeared. The opinions that seemed so important faded with time. The fear of not being enough slowly lost its power. The pressure to compare myself with everyone else became quieter every year. What remained was something much stronger. Self-respect. That was the real destination all along. A few weeks later, I was invited back to the community center where I had once helped restore the building. Walking through those familiar halls brought back memories of fresh paint, unfinished walls, and people working together with hope. Now the building was alive. Children were laughing in the classrooms. Artists were displaying their work. Families gathered for local events. The place had become exactly what everyone had imagined years before. One young volunteer approached me. I've heard you've been involved since the beginning, they said. I nodded. What was the most important part? I looked around before answering. It wasn't rebuilding the building. They looked confused. It was believing it could become something better before anyone else could see it. As soon as I said those words, I realized they described people just as much as buildings. Every meaningful transformation begins long before the results are visible. It begins with belief. On my way home, I stopped beside a quiet lake just as the sun was beginning to set. The water reflected the skies so perfectly that it almost looked like another world. I thought about every chapter of the journey. The uncertainty, the quiet evenings, the notebook, the conversations, the lessons that only made sense after enough time had passed. None of them had been wasted. Every experience had quietly shaped the person I had become. When I arrived home, I placed the notebook back on the shelf. Not because the journey was over, because I no longer needed written reminders to believe in myself. The lessons had become habits. The habits had become character. And that character would guide every chapter still waiting to be written. Before turning off the lights, I stood in front of the same mirror that had witnessed the beginning of everything. Years ago, I stood there looking for perfection. Tonight, I saw something far more valuable.
Peace.
I finally understood the meaning behind the title that had followed me throughout the journey. Beauty truly came with new rules. Not rules about appearance, Not rules created by strangers, but rules built through kindness, patience, courage, humility, and honesty. Rules that could never be measured by a reflection. Rules that could only be measured by the life a person chose to live. I smiled one last time, switched off the light, and walked away from the mirror without looking back. Because the reflection no longer needed to convince me of anything. The person I had become was already enough. And that was the most beautiful rule I would ever write.